What is the church? To some, it might seem like a fairly juvenile question. Surely everyone in the world knows what the church is, right? That is, until we get below the surface a bit and began to ask some deeper questions. Things like, how does one become a part of the church? Is there a way to leave it? What's its primary mark of identity? Who decides what the church is and does? What happens if there's disagreement? The more we pull the thread, the more we can see that the idea of church is not clearly understood or wholly agreed upon. In fact, there are at least 5 completely different models for understanding what exactly the church is and does. This is Catholicism in Focus. The reason I suggest that there are at least 5 models is because really, there are theoretically infinite ways of describing the nature of the church. As we continue to grow in faith over time, further metaphors may emerge that more adequately capture who we are. And the reason I suggest that there are at least 5 is because some smart guy said so once. That smart guy was Avery Dulles, the prolific Jesuit theologian and seminary professor of the 20th century. In 1974, he published his landmark work, Models of the Church, a study of ecclesiology that continues to serve as a foundation for seminary studies even today. In it, you guessed it, he suggests that there are 5 ways of understanding the life and mission of the church. The most popular way, he suggests, is that of an institution, a society with visible structures, clear boundaries, and a central focus on the rights and powers of those who lead the church. Much like a gym or political party, one officially joins an institution and becomes a member by following protocols and submitting to the authority of its leaders. As members, there is no sense of ownership of the institution or ability to change its direction. One is simply a part of what the leaders construct. In this sense, boundaries are extremely clear, and there is never ambiguity as to who is in and who is out. One is either a member in accordance with the laws of the leader and so given certain rights and responsibilities, or one is not. The obvious strength of this model is that it provides clarity and fosters a visible and public sense of solidarity. Everyone inside the institution is of one mind, and so the institution serves as a sort of perfect society against the rest of the world. On the other hand, there's an even more obvious weakness to this model. There's no sense of what the institution does. Focused entirely on the structure, it has the possibility of becoming rigid, doctrinaire, and conformist, and Dulles himself says that this could never serve as the primary model for church. There must be some content to go with the structure. It's for this reason that Dulles suggests a model on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, that of church as mystical communion. Whereas the institution focuses on strict adherence and formal admittance, the mystical communion model focuses primarily on one's transcendent relationship with God. Being church is a spiritual reality. Those who are intimately connected with God are also connected with one another. In its most inclusive sense, this model recognizes the oneness that all people share in being children of God, and so the idea of joining or becoming members makes no sense. Simply existing grants us automatic entrance and communion with one another. A slightly more refined sense would focus on the church as the body of Christ, the union of people described by St. Paul, transcending culture, location, time, or even church affiliation. If we are one with Christ, we are one with each other. Where the institution model lacks a sense of dynamism and transcendence, this model thrives and certainly captures what we all know the church to be in some sense, a mystical union that goes beyond human structures. Where it's found lacking, though, is in its propensity to slip into relativism, as there is no central theological, missionary, or leadership structure guiding the community. For those looking for a happy medium, Dulles suggests a third model, that of the church as the sacrament of salvation. Just as a sacrament is a visible sign of an invisible grace, so too is the church a visible sign of God's grace on earth. Those who are part of the church are those who manifest God in their lives and are efficacious in the production of the fruit of the Spirit. The central identity marker of this model, then, is not a formal membership or spiritual communion, but the visible sign of holiness in our lives. When people encounter the church, they encounter the living and true God and are filled with grace. The strength of this model is that it provides immense meaning to the life of the church and world, serving as a sign of God and dispensing grace through a life of holiness. That said, Dulles notes that it is the least accessible to the common Christian, using abstract language and images that are very difficult to comprehend on a popular level. Most will not be able to easily describe what they are to others. This is quite different from the final 2 models, which are arguably the simplest to describe: the church as herald and the church as servant. Although somewhat opposite in focus, their nature is essentially the same in that they are models of imitation. The herald teaches what Jesus taught, while the servant does what Jesus did. In this way, the strengths and weaknesses of each offer a bit of a foil for the other. The herald, giving attention to the word proclaimed, connects people who share in the common mission of evangelization. If someone shares the good news with their lips and brings someone closer to Christ, then they are the church. The problem, as one can see, is that it gives little to no attention to the incarnational aspects of the faith experience, living entirely in a spiritual or intellectual realm. The servant model of church, being defined by doing what Jesus did, answers this problem. The manifestation of the suffering servant, the church is made up of those who walk in the footsteps of Christ, being agents of reconciliation, healing, feeding, and building. It's not enough to proclaim the kingdom. One must get their hands dirty and actually do something about the sinful structures on earth. Of course, what is lacking for the servant is the strength of the herald, a spiritual foundation. While it's great to recognize the inbreaking of heaven and build the kingdom through acts, if all that it is about doing good works, it runs the risk of slipping into secular humanism, doing good works without Christ as the foundation, or even Pelagianism, believing that our works bring about our salvation. Not exactly a perfect model. But then again, which one is? Within these frameworks, the institution, mystical communion, sacrament of salvation, herald and servant, what we see are immensely important qualities of the church. The church may not be solely an institutional structure that one becomes a member of, but there's certainly some truth to that. Right? Similarly, there's definitely a transcendent quality to our relationship with each other, going beyond human factors. We are a people who express God's holiness to the world, announcing the kingdom and doing the works of peace and justice. All of these models offer a profound truth of the church that cannot be overlooked, and yet cannot stand on its own. And I think that's what Dulles meant to call our attention to in developing them. The point is not to choose one over the other, that one model is better or worse than the rest, but rather that they emphasize an important quality that the church already exhibits and fundamentally needs. In this way, rather than choosing which model we like best, it might be better to look at it from the opposite perspective. In our church today, are each of these qualities properly lived out, or might there be an imbalance of one that we need to fix?